She had been in our lives for 11 months. 11 months of Sunday dinners, of borrowing my son's car, of calling me Dad before I'd ever invited her to. And I had smiled through every single one of those moments, because my son looked happier than I had seen him since his mother passed. That's the part that still sits heavy with me, even now. Not the money, not the forgery, the fact that she knew exactly which door to walk through. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a commercial litigation attorney in Calgary before I retired, and in that time I watched more people than I can count sign documents they should never have signed, trust people they should never have trusted, and lose things they could never get back. I thought that history had made me careful. I thought I knew what manipulation looked like when it was standing right in front of me. I was wrong. Or rather, I was right, but I was too late. My son's name is Liam. He's 37, a structural engineer, works for a firm that does bridge contracts across Alberta and BC. He's quiet the way his mother was quiet, not shy, just steady. The kind of man who thinks before he speaks, who shows up when he says he will, who fixes things with his hands on weekends because he genuinely likes the work. After his mother died 4 years ago, he folded inward for a long time. I watched him date nobody, go nowhere, and pour everything into his job and his small house in Cochrane. I worried, the way fathers worry, quietly and without saying much. So when he called me on a Thursday evening in early February and said, "Dad, I've been seeing someone and I think you should meet her," I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for years. Her name was Vanessa Pruitt. She told us she was 34, that she'd grown up in Kelowna, that she worked as a fundraising coordinator for a children's literacy foundation based in Edmonton. She was polished in the way that certain people are polished, not flashy, but precise. The right amount of warmth, the right amount of modesty, the right questions asked at the right moment. When I shook her hand that first evening at Liam's kitchen table, she looked me in the eye and said, "Liam talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." And I thought, this woman is very good at this. I didn't know yet what this was. The months that followed were pleasant on the surface. She came to family dinners. She remembered things that I took my coffee black, that my late wife had collected those small blue pottery birds you find at craft markets, that Liam's favorite hockey team had broken his heart 3 playoffs in a row. She had a way of referencing those details at just the right moment, not showing off that she'd memorized them, but weaving them in so naturally that you felt seen. That's the word I kept coming back to later, when I was turning it all over in my mind. She made you feel seen, and that feeling is extraordinarily powerful to people who have been lonely. By April, she was at Liam's house most weekends. By June, she had a drawer there, then a shelf, then her name on the building's parcel delivery list. By August, Liam called me and said, "Dad, I'm going to ask her to marry me." He sounded nervous and certain at the same time, the way a man sounds when he's already made up his mind and is really just telling you, not asking. I said, "Congratulations." I meant it. The engagement party was held at my house in late September. About 40 people, mostly family and a handful of Liam's friends from work. Vanessa had suggested the venue herself, and I'd agreed without thinking much about it. It was only later that I realized she had been very interested in the house, in the details of it, the square footage, the renovation I'd done in 2019, whether I'd owned it outright. She'd asked those questions so lightly, folded inside conversation about interior design and neighborhood history, that I hadn't noticed I was answering them. The moment that changed everything came 3 days after the party. Liam and I were sitting at my kitchen table, going through some of the leftover food, the way we do after gatherings, talking about nothing in particular, and then he went quiet for a moment, in that particular way he has when something is sitting on him. I waited. He said, "Dad, Vanessa asked me something last week, and I've been thinking about it." I said, "What did she ask?" He said she had brought up my estate, specifically whether I had a will, and whether Liam was the primary beneficiary, and whether, once they were married, it might make sense to have her name added to any trust structure so that assets could flow without complication. She had framed it as planning, practical, loving, even so that nothing gets stuck in probate and you don't lose any of it to the government. I kept my face very still. Then Liam said, "I know it sounds strange when I say it out loud, and I trust her. I do. But I wanted to tell you, because I knew you'd want to know. I looked at my son across that table, and I thought two things simultaneously. The first was that I was grateful deeply, completely grateful that he had told me. The second was that a woman who raised the topic of a future father-in-law's estate within 3 months of an engagement was not planning for a life together. She was planning for an exit. I said, "Thank you for telling me. I'm not worried. Let's not say anything to her yet." Liam nodded slowly. He trusted me. That trust was something I did not take lightly. I want to be clear about what I did next, because I've thought about it a great deal since. I am not an impulsive man. I didn't want to blow up my son's relationship on instinct, or on the prejudice of an old litigator who had seen too many bad actors. I wanted facts, so I went looking for them the way I knew how. The following Monday, I called a colleague named Patricia Morel, who had practiced family law in Edmonton for over 25 years, and who knew virtually everyone in the nonprofit sector in that city. I asked her, casually, if she'd ever come across a Vanessa Pruitt working in fundraising for a children's literacy organization. There was a pause. Patricia said she didn't know that name. I said I'd appreciate it if she could ask around quietly. She said she would. 2 days later, she called back. She had spoken to 3 people in the Edmonton nonprofit community. None of them had ever heard of Vanessa Pruitt. One of them, who had been with a literacy foundation in Edmonton for 12 years, said no such person had ever worked there in any capacity. I sat with that for a day, before I did anything else. Then I hired a private investigator. His name is Gerald Firth, semi-retired, former RCMP, based in Red Deer. I'd referred clients to him over the years, and trusted his discretion completely. I gave him Vanessa's full name as Liam knew it, her stated age and hometown, and the name of the organization she claimed to work for. I told him I needed to know who she actually was. Gerald came back to me in 9 days. What he found, I have turned over in my mind many times since, and each time I turn it over, I feel the same cold clarity I felt sitting in my study reading his report. Vanessa Pruitt did not exist. Not in any continuous, documented way that held up. The name appeared on a driver's license issued in BC approximately 4 years earlier, with a residential address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in Kamloops. Before that, the trail led to a woman who had used the name Sandra Rowe in Manitoba, and before that a woman named Danielle Hebert, who had been the subject of a civil complaint in Saskatchewan. A complaint filed by the adult son of a retired grain farmer who alleged that she had misrepresented her identity, induced him to name her as a beneficiary on 2 insurance policies, and disappeared before the relationship concluded in marriage. The complaint had been settled. No criminal charges had been laid. There was also a man. Gerald had identified him through a phone number that appeared in records connected to the Kamloops, address a number that Vanessa had used to call Liam on several occasions before switching to the phone number Liam knew. The man's name was Troy Santu. He was 38, had a history of petty fraud convictions in Ontario from his early 20s, and had been living at an address in Red Deer for the past 2 years. Gerald believed, based on the pattern of contact and some additional research I'll leave out here, that Troy and Vanessa were working together. He was not posing as a relative, this time he was staying out of sight. But he was close. I read that report on a Wednesday evening in October. The wedding was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday of November, 6 weeks away. The rehearsal dinner was the Friday before. I did not tell Liam yet. This is the decision I have thought about most, and I want to explain my reasoning, because I know some people will disagree with it. Liam was in love with this woman. He had been in love with her for almost a year. The trauma of learning that she was not who she said she was, that every intimate conversation, every shared meal, every moment of what he believed was genuine affection had been constructed, was going to be devastating. I needed to be very certain before I handed him that devastation. And I needed to be certain in a way that she could not dispute, minimize, or explain away. So I spent the next 3 weeks gathering more. I obtained, through Patricia's contacts, a signed statement from the administrator of the Literacy Foundation confirming no employee named Vanessa Pruitt had ever been affiliated with the organization. Gerald located a woman in Saskatoon who had been in a relationship with Troy Santu 5 years earlier and was willing to speak on record about his history of financial manipulation. I also hired a forensic document examiner, a woman I had used as an expert witness in my litigation years, to review copies of credentials Vanessa had shared with Liam early in their relationship. A university degree, a reference letter from a previous employer. Both were forgeries. Not crude ones, but forgeries nonetheless. I kept going to Sunday dinners. I watched Vanessa pour my coffee and ask about my health and suggest, twice more in conversation, that it would mean so much to her to feel truly part of the family before the wedding. I smiled and changed the subject both times. She was watching me too, I think. There were moments when I caught her eyes resting on me just a fraction of a second too long, recalibrating something. But she had no reason to act. As far as she knew, she was 6 weeks from the finish line. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private room in a restaurant in downtown Calgary. Liam had chosen the place. A quiet room with dark wood paneling and windows overlooking the river. The kind of room where voices carry just far enough, and not further. About 20 people, immediate family, the wedding party, a few close friends. I had asked the restaurant manager, a man I had known for many years, if there was a small meeting room available, adjacent to the private dining space. He said yes, a room they used for event consultations. I reserved it. I had spoken to Liam 3 days before the dinner. I told him everything. I sat across from him at that same kitchen table, and I laid it out, document by document, calmly and completely, the way I had once laid out case files for juries. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was very level, which told me how hard he was working to hold himself together. He said, "What do you need from me?" I told him. He agreed. At the rehearsal dinner, Liam and I were seated next to each other, as we'd arranged. Partway through the second course, Liam leaned toward Vanessa and said he needed to step out for a moment to take a call from his site foreman, an ongoing issue with a bridge contract that had been running through the whole fall. She accepted this without a flicker. Then Liam touched my arm as he stood, and I excused myself a moment later. The three of us met in the consultation room. Liam closed the door. What I had expected was a performance protests, tears, a carefully constructed denial. What I got instead, when I placed the folder of documents on the table and told her quietly that I knew who she was and who Troy Sandu was, and that I had spoken to the woman in Saskatoon, and that I had a forensic report on the credentials she had given my son, what I got was silence. A long, very still silence. And then something shifted in her face, something that I can only describe as the work of the performance being set down. She looked tired, older, suddenly, more real than she had ever looked across a dinner table. She didn't admit everything. She didn't need to. She said, very quietly, "What do you want?" I told her I wanted her to leave the dinner tonight, with whatever excuse she chose to give. I wanted her belongings out of Liam's house, within 48 hours, and I wanted her to understand that I had submitted copies of Gerald's report and the forensic analysis to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit that afternoon, along with what I knew about the civil complaint in Saskatchewan and the woman's information in Saskatoon. I told her that whether charges were pursued was not in my hands, and that was the truth. She looked at Liam once. He didn't look back. She picked up her purse, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked out. She told the table she'd received a call about a family emergency. She was gracious about it. Even at the end, she was gracious about it. That, somehow, was the part that stayed with me the longest. Liam held it together through the rest of the dinner. He is his mother's son. In that way, he can carry weight in public and put it down later, in private, where it belongs. On the drive home, I put my hand briefly on his shoulder at a red light, and he nodded once without looking at me. There was nothing to say that the gesture hadn't already covered. The wedding did not happen. The venue was cancelled. The guests were notified with a brief message that the engagement had ended. Liam took a week off work and stayed at my house. He ate. He slept. He watched hockey and sat with the silence the way you have to sit with it when something real has been taken from you. He didn't talk much about her. After about 4 days, he started talking more. And what he talked about, mostly, was his work and a hiking trip he wanted to do in the spring in the Kootenays, and whether I thought the truck needed new winter tires. I let him lead. That is all a father can do. I want to say something about what I filed with the RCMP, because I know this is the part some people will have questions about. I did not simply let her walk away. I want to be very clear about that. I filed everything I had. Every document, every statement, Gerald's complete report, the forensic analysis, the information connecting Vanessa to Troy Sandu, and the thread back to the civil complaint in Saskatchewan. A financial crimes investigator contacted me 3 weeks later, and we had a lengthy conversation. I was told the matter was under active review. I cannot say more than that, because I genuinely don't know more than that. What I know is that I did what I could do. What I could not do was prosecute her myself, or ensure an outcome I had no control over. The law moves at the speed the law moves at, and I learned that over 31 years better than most people learn it. Liam as well. He took that hiking trip in the Kootenays in May, and sent me photographs from the trail, dense, green, granite, a lake so clear you could see the bottom in photographs. He looked like himself. He looked, actually, more like himself than he had in some time, and I thought about how a person sometimes has to lose something false before they can fully inhabit what's real. I've been asked, by people who know pieces of this story, how I stayed calm through all of it. Through the Sunday dinners and the coffee she poured, and the twice she'd floated the idea of being truly part of the family. I'm not sure calm is the right word. What I was, more precisely, was resolved. I had one job, which was to protect my son without doing more damage in the protecting than the harm had already done. That required patience, and it required keeping my face still when what I felt was cold fury, and it required trusting that evidence was more powerful than anger, which it always is. There are things I would tell any parent in a situation that even partially resembles this one. Not as a lecture, as someone who has sat on both sides of the table, professionally and personally, and learned some things the hard way. Trust the discomfort. Not every feeling of unease is jealousy or possessiveness, or an aging parent refusing to let go. Sometimes it is your accumulated experience telling you that the pattern you are looking at doesn't add up. That feeling deserves investigation, not suppression. Verify before you confront. Confronting someone on instinct gives them time to explain, reframe, and manage you. Confronting someone with documented facts gives them very little room to move. In 31 years of litigation, I never once walked into a hearing without every piece of evidence organized and ready. There is no reason to do it differently in your personal life. Protect without controlling. My goal was never to make Liam's decision for him. My goal was to make sure he had the truth before he made it. That is the only intervention a parent is actually entitled to make. Give information to the proper authorities, completely and promptly. Not because it guarantees a result, it doesn't, but because the next person this woman approached deserved someone to have filed that report, and I was the someone who had the information to file. And finally, don't let the grief of it harden you. What was done to my son was cynical and calculated, and it used his loneliness and his goodness as tools, and that is enraging. But my son's loneliness and his goodness are real. They are his. The person who tried to exploit them is gone. What remains is him, still steady, still showing up, still the kind of man who fixes things with his hands on weekends and thinks before he speaks. That's what I held on to through all of it. That's what I hold on to still.